Can we take the cracks and the fissures and the breaks in the world that we see and the hearts that we feel within, somehow turn those into something that can allow us a different dimension into Tshuvah? And so I will just begin by looking at something that we're going to read this coming week in the afternoon of Yom Kippur, Maftir Yonah, the Maftir for Mincha. And here's the last couple of verses of chapter 3 and a couple of verses from chapter 4. Not all the verses, I skipped a few here. And just something, summarize it very quickly. We'll talk about it and then we'll move on. Vayar Elohim et ma'asehem ki shavu midarkam hara'a vayinachem Elohim hara'a asher diber la'asot lehem v'lo asa. So God saw the deeds that they had done. I'll come back to the translation in a minute, that Nineveh did in repenting. And God changed God's mind. And God decided not to do what was planned. Vayera el Yonah ra'a gdola vayichar lo. And this was, as it says in English here, this is the Robert Alter, phenomenal translation by Robert Alter. This thing was very evil for Jonah, and he was incensed, and he prayed to the Lord and said, I beseech you, Lord, was it not my word when I was still in my land? Why are you making me out to be wrong? I mean, I didn't want this job. I had actually fled this job, and you forced me to come back to this job. And then I issue a prophecy to Nineveh, and you proved me wrong. Now, on a certain level, Jonah should have exactly the opposite response, right? Because he's been told to go warn Nineveh that if you don't repent, God is going to punish you. And they repent, right? Look at verse 6 on the left-hand side. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he rose from his throne and took off his mantle and covered himself in sackcloth and sat upon ashes. And then God saw their acts and God relented, and so on and so forth. What's Jonah upset about? Why does Jonah feel betrayed when the purpose of the prophecy was realized completely? God told Jonah, go to Nineveh and tell them that they're going to be destroyed. Now, he could have said, tell them that unless they repent, they will be destroyed. That's true, but Jonah should have really understood what it was that a prophet does, and yet Jonah is angry. Jonah feels betrayed by God because the people of Nineveh repent and God does not destroy them. Why? There are a lot of possibilities, and we've all heard many discussions of the book of Jonah with this regard, but I want to actually suggest that what happened here was that Jonah was forced to reconsider who the people of Nineveh were. He went to Nineveh certain that they were evil. Otherwise, why would God have told them that they were going to be punished? So God says, basically, go to Nineveh and tell them that I'm going to destroy them. Jonah goes, and then suddenly God decides not to destroy them. And what Jonah has to therefore do in his own mind, if he were up to it, which he probably isn't, it seems, is to ask himself, wow, maybe I need to rethink these people of Nineveh. Maybe they're not quite as evil as I had originally imagined. God is willing to accept their change. Jonah, it seems to me, is not. And I think it's true of many of us. It's true with many of us about people. It's true with many of us about ideas. It's true with many of us about all sorts of things. We don't really want to be challenged to think about them differently. We know what we think. We're right about this and they're wrong about that. They injured us in this way and I am wounded because of them, because of that. I agree with this idea. I don't agree with that idea. I might be willing to learn a little bit about it one way or the other, but fundamentally, I know how I feel about this person, this thing, this idea, and I don't really want to change. I didn't come to my position lightly. It's well thought through, and so therefore I don't want to change right now. And I think partly what the Maftir of Yonah is telling us is no, that part of our own repentance has to be our willingness not only to think about ourselves differently, but to think about others differently, and to ask ourselves if we might see other people, other ideas, other things in a different light than we used to. And this was brought home to me. For me, what was a very, very powerful way right after Rosh Hashanah. So my wife and I davened in an outside minyan. We were personally not very excited about the idea of going in. Somehow I got muted there, but I unmuted myself. I took the liberty, Rabbi Bolton, of unmuting myself. I hope that's okay. But in any,
you're the co-host.
I mean, I'm happy to be muted, but it might just be a little bit weird. But in any event, we davened literally just it's a 2-minute walk from where we are, and we went to a hashkama minyan. They had to try to get a lot of different minyanim into this one very large playground recreational area, My wife very much wanted to be at the minyan that would be the least populated for obvious reasons. And so we went to the Hashkama minyan at 6 o'clock in the morning, knowing full well that we had to be done by like 10 of 9 because the next minyan was starting in exactly the same place at 9 o'clock. So we went at 6. I would say I went at 6. She joined me a little bit later. But that was all fine and well and good. And there was this guy who was running the minyan who was just unbelievably gracious. I didn't really know him. I've seen him a few times in the past few months as we've gathered together for this early outside minyan when inside davening has either been completely not allowed or very limited in Israel. Looks like it's going back to being not allowed over Yom Kippur. It's a pretty extraordinary thing. Things have to be pretty dire in the Jewish state if the cabinet is deliberating right at this very, very moment the possibility of shuttering all synagogues in the state of Israel on Yom Kippur. And the chief rabbi came out today and said that he would support that. I mean, things have to be bad. And in fact, today, Haifa brought in its first truck of the kind that New York tragically had in those early days of the pandemic when things were totally out of control. So it's a scary time here. It's a frightening time here. Frustrated, angry, people feel many different things. But in any event, we were davening outside at this minyan, and this guy was just wonderful. There were different little areas called kapsulot in Hebrew where you had to sit in one area and not another. The whole idea was ludicrous and it didn't work, of course, but he was doing it in a very nice kind of a way. He made everybody feel very welcome. He was the gabbai and the guard, and he was the mask police, and he did his mask policing in a very lovely kind of a way. And then my wife and I basically took 2 folding chairs and moved them 30 feet off to the side to sit entirely by ourselves, and he totally understood. He was entirely accommodating, and I didn't know who this guy was. So I thought it would be nice to write him a quick note after Rosh Hashanah, telling him that I thought he had done just a lovely job of making people feel so at home. He was just so sweet and so warm and so giving. So I wrote somebody in the minyan who I knew, and I said, who is this guy who ran the minyan? Just a lovely guy. Give me his name and his coordinates, because I want to thank him. And they sent me his name and coordinates, and his name sort of rang a bell, but I wasn't quite sure from where. And so I Googled him. And it turns out, as he popped up all over the place as soon as I Googled him, needless to say, I won't mention his name. And he, let's put it this way, because we're in Aseret Yemei Tshuvah. He is the founder of a political organization, Israel, which does not exactly mirror my predispositions, try to put it that way. It's an organization that I have actually no patience for whatsoever. And I have at times, I think, had to have a scotch or two after reading various things that they have done. And I all of a sudden realized how grateful I was that I hadn't known who he was before I experienced his warmth, before I experienced the genuine love in him that he has, even though we might agree about more than I imagined, but we're probably very far apart on a whole array of political ideas. Had I known in advance that here's this guy named so-and-so, and he does X, Y, and Z, and I'd gone to the minyan, I would have said, oh, that guy again, whatever. But I didn't know. And it enabled me to kind of have to rethink what I thought about that organization, simply because the guy who I learned founded it is such an unbelievably warm, loving, caring human being, who I also got to watch daven, by the way, and he really davens. And so you learn something about somebody's soul from watching them pray as well. And that's kind of what I meant when I was saying about Yonah. He didn't want to do that. And I felt that for me, one of the most important moments of Rosh Hashanah actually happened on Monday when I got his coordinates and Googled him. I mean, Rosh Hashanah was lovely. The davening was beautiful. We sang. We also got out in 3 hours, which isn't so bad. But and we got out by 9 o'clock in the morning, so it hadn't gotten terribly hot here. But it was lovely. It was really just very, very lovely. And we really had a very nice davening. But on Monday, when I looked him up and I found that out, that was a humbling moment for me. That was the moment that I actually felt that I'd entered Aseret Yemei Tshuvah. That was the moment that something broke. That was the moment where I said, whoa, maybe I really need to actually not only reimagine who this guy might be if I had no predispositions, but actually imagine what he's done with his life, because he's really unbelievable. So that's the kind of thing that I have in mind with Jonah. And it is, let me just make sure I share the correct screen here. Right. And now that's what I'd like to see if we can do about another kind of an issue altogether. And here I want to talk a little bit about the unraveling relationship between American Jews and Israel. This little origami is a very creative, I didn't make it up, somebody made it up in New York, and I found it very appealing. But I think that the origami, which is of course fake, it exists only in a computer somewhere, but the origami kind of suggests what's happened to us over the course of these years. That was what was once a very intimate, interrelated, deeply connected relationship. It began to fray a little bit and might have actually frayed a lot more. Now, I know that given the world in which we live, both here in Israel and in America, the issue of American Jews in Israel is actually a subsided issue right now. We're concerned about lots of other things, and quite rightly so. I mean, America, we're concerned about civil discourse and civility in general, worried about what's going to happen the morning after on November 4th and 5th and 6th. What are the streets going to look like? And a whole array of questions. And here in Israel, we're really worrying, can we get this thing back in the bottle, or are people here going to keep dying at outrageous rates? And what's going to happen if we can't get it back? It's a very scary time, but I do want to revisit this issue just a little bit. And I want to kind of try to begin by reviewing the history of this issue a little bit. So we'll go back to the early years of reform in the United States, which is, this is not the Pittsburgh Platform itself, but it's a quote from an explanation of the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Pittsburgh Platform. And this is a quote from Jonathan Sarna's book, American Judaism, which I think is by far the single best single volume history of American Judaism. The Pittsburgh Platform of 1885 forswore Zionism, and in 1898, which is obviously 13 years later, a resolution of the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, spelled out the reform anti-Zionist position in detail. We are unalterably opposed to political Zionism. The Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. Zion was a precious possession of the past, Zion the place. As such, it is a holy memory, but it is not our hope of the future. America is our Zion. Just want to let that sink in for a moment, given the pain and the heartbreak that many of us are feeling about America these days. America is our Zion. Here is the home of religious liberty. We have aided in the founding of this new Zion, the fruition of the beginning laid in the old. The mission of Judaism is spiritual, not political. Its aim is not to establish a state, but to spread the truths of religion and humanity throughout the world. Okay, it's a position that we know. We know that it was associated with the reform movement early on. We know that there were elements of the Orthodox community that were also anti-Zionist in its early days. The conservative movement, by the way, also had its period. It's common. When I was at JTS, it was just uptown from where you are right now, where most of you are, I assume. It was common to say, and I remember that Chancellor Schorsch always used to tell us when he was chancellor, when we were rabbinical students, that both Reform and Orthodoxy had their anti-Zionist periods, and the conservative movement had not. And that's basically true, but it's not quite that pure. In other words, Chancellor Finkelstein refused to have Hatikvah played at commencement in 1948, just after the state had been established. And in fact, students at Union Theological Seminary across Broadway play it on the church bells because they couldn't get anybody at the seminary to play. It's more complicated. All avenues of Jewish life had a complicated relationship with Zionism. This is an example from Reform, but there are examples from all of the various movements. And here's one that has got nothing to do with any of the religious movements, but it's from 1950. Jacob Blaustein, who was the president at that point of the American Jewish Committee. He and Ben-Gurion, we won't go into the history now, but he and Ben-Gurion had a very long and controversial relationship. Blaustein could not stand that Ben-Gurion would come to America in 1948, 1949, and 1950 and say, there's a new center of the Jewish world now that Israel's been created. And Blaustein would say, what are you talking about? There's more Jews in New York City than there are Jews in your entire country. What are you talking about? A new center of the Jewish world? Stop that. And Ben-Gurion would come and say that American Jews should move to Israel, and Blaustein would say, stop that too. And eventually they blew up, and they came to an agreement called the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion Agreement, which Blaustein is explaining to his board here in a document from 1950. American Jews, young and old alike, Zionists and non-Zionists alike. Don't forget, back then it was not at all uncomfortable to talk about the American Jewish Committee having a non-Zionist flank. It was actually a very big flank. Are profoundly attached to their country. American welcomed our immigrant parents in their need. Under America's free institutions, they and their children have achieved that freedom and sense of security unknown for long centuries of travail. We have truly become Americans, just as have all other oppressed groups that have ever come to these shores. Now, many people in America would find that last phrase very dubious at this particular time in American history, but we'll put that aside. We repudiate vigorously the suggestion that American Jews are in exile. The future of American Jewry, of our children and our children's children, is entirely linked with the future of America. Entirely linked with the future of America. We have no alternative. We want no alternative. This is not about a religious ideology, whether it's Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox. And this is not quite a century. It's a half a century after the previous document that we read. But it's once again in the middle of the 20th century, a very clear statement that whatever Zion or Zionism was going to be, it wasn't about us as American Jews. We're Americans. We didn't need that Israel thing. We didn't necessarily even want that Israel thing. And at the end of the day, basically, Blaustein said in a different place, the idea of a Jewish state is a good idea because we need something to do with all of those displaced Jewish persons in Europe. We need a place for them to go. What he was saying, of course, is he didn't want them to come to America. But that's another issue. This is, I'm going to give you one other architectural example. This is an incredibly beautiful sanctuary. Excuse me?
Move into presentation mode so we can see the architecture. You've got the shared screen is with the preview of the next slide.
Okay, how do I do that? Huh.
You go up to the top of your screen, use slideshow, I believe.
Okay, wow, learn something from your students every day. Is that it?
That's it.
Oh, wow, learn something new. It's a gorgeous. What's that?
I said, I promised you I'd be the IT Rebbe today.
Yeah, you were. Kol hakavod lecha. Anyway, this is an incredibly beautiful sanctuary. It's Cherith Israel in San Francisco, built at the end of the 1800s. And if you look on the left, to your left on the screen, there's a window, a half-circled window, with two red blotches. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit on that red blotch. Now you can see that. This is that window. And what you have in this window, of course, is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, bringing down the 10 Commandments. Little bit hard to see in this particular view, but nonetheless, if you know your American national parks, you know that the two mountains in the back are El Capitan and Half Dome. In other words, there are two mountains in Yosemite National Park. Moses is bringing down the tablets from not Mount Sinai, but from Yosemite. And it's really the ultimate statement that somehow or another, we have really gotten to a place where not only do American Jews feel comfortable in America, but Torah even comes from America. Not only is America our new Zion, but America is even our new Mount Sinai. This is part of a long-standing tradition in which basically American Jews said that whole Zionism thing really isn't entirely for us. Now, it's not only, by the way, that American Jews didn't have a lot of patience for Zionism. The same was true of Zionists, but when it became talking about America, this is very much a two-way street. Now, everybody loves to talk about Chaim Nachman Bialik, El HaTzipor, or Hachama Mirosh Ha'ilanot Nistalka, what we sing before Shabbat, or if we're talking about the horrors of Europe prior to the Shoah, we might quote his poems Ala Shchita, or Be'ir HaHarega, about the slaughter, or in the city of slaughter, and so on and so forth. But Bialik also was a kind of a Zionist theorist, in addition to being a brilliant poet. And here's what he says about Zionism and diaspora. This is not the part that typically gets quoted when we name a day school or a prize after Bialik. But this is what he wrote. It is up to us to choose between extinction and redemption. The remnant of Israel, which has been tried in fire and water, which over the generations has withstood with pride manifold trials and tribulations without ever surrendering, will not allow itself to be sacrificed. It must recognize its responsibility to save itself from the rot and destruction of life in Israel. This is a man who knew how to pick his words. He's the greatest living poet of the Jewish people at this point. And when he says the rot and destruction of life in exile, and he doesn't say Europe, he says exile, he knows what he's saying. We don't have to agree, but it's clear that he knows what he's saying. Every Jew must certainly recognize that even the little that we are doing thus far in the rebuilding of Jerusalem, because in 1926 it was barely getting started, is 1,000-fold more consequential than everything we are building in the exile. In other words, think about Polish Jewry at this point. This is the heyday of Polish Jewry. Millions of Polish Jews, about 3 million at this point in Jewish history. There will be 300,000 left at the end of the war because 90% literally will be exterminated. But there are 3 million Jews in Poland. The Polish Jewish community has been an extraordinary crown jewel of the Jewish people for between 600 and 1,000 years, depending on how you count. He says every little thing that we do in the rebuilding of Jerusalem is 1,000-fold more consequential than that. Our brothers who are on the front line sacrificing their flesh and blood, while those who remain afar are committing a sin against their people for which there can be no expiation. There is no expiating sin in this period of Aseret Yemei Tshuvah. The sin of sitting back and not building Eretz Yisrael, says Bialik, there is no expiation for that sin. The time has come for us all to recognize this, to muster our strength to fulfill the weighty obligation which history has bequeathed to our people. It's pretty strong words. Ben Zion Dinur is not as well known. He eventually will become Israel's education minister, but this he writes before the creation of the state. What is the ideological basis of Zionism? First and foremost, what is Zionism about? It is the denigration of the exile. To understand exile and to teach our students about the various characteristics of exile from Egypt through our own time, and to make clear the accommodation and inauthenticity at the heart of exile, its instability and the rises and declines it invariably brings. Zionism as a revolution against exile, a declaration of war on it. That is an unbelievable thing to say. The first requirement for victory is to know the enemy. And what's the enemy? Jewish life in exile. So when I point to those quotes from whether it's Blaustein or it's the Union of American Hebrew Congregations or the architecture of Shereth Israel in San Francisco, it's not one-sided. People like Ben Zion Dinur and Bialik were saying something very similar on the other side. These two groups of people grew up thinking that they didn't need or didn't want the other. Blaustein expressly said that the state of Israel was a good place to have because then the people who were dispossessed of their homes in Europe could go there, because we certainly didn't want them coming to American shores. And Ben Zion Dinur said that our obligation as Zionist educators was to teach our kids about the rot and the enemy that is fundamentally the Jewish community outside of Israel. It's extraordinary, powerful language on the parts of both. But then we begin to see that there is a beginning of a shift. This is just a scan. You can get this, by the way, on the website of the National Library of Israel. This is a small book by Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai. It's hard to see his name on the front there, even though it is there. But it's called Petach Kechuda Shel Chut. And we won't go through, time is running a little short. We won't go through the Hebrew here, but I'll show you the translation, okay? And here he's trying to do something very interesting. It's not entirely correct, I don't think, but it's very clever and interesting. Know that the primary meaning of Tshuvah, I'm just translating here what was on the previous page in that little scan, is that a person returns to the place from which he came, as in, and his return, Tshuvato, was to Ramah, for there was his home in the first book of Samuel. On the off chance that any of you are up to date on Daf Yomi, you're still doing the daily page of Talmud, actually, the Beit Din that Shmuel had in the place of Ramah is actually totally coincidentally in today's page 40-something in the middle of Eruvin. Chazal then borrowed the term, says Rabbi Alkalai, who lives from about more or less 1800 to 1880, give or take. He's a Sephardi rabbi who in the middle of his career life becomes deeply, deeply, deeply Zionist and is really one of the great forward-thinking people at the helm of a Zionist movement, by the way, which we think of mostly as an Ashkenazi movement. And here's an example of a very powerful Sephardi personality who doesn't usually get his due, but was very, very instrumental in Zionist thinking in those early years. And he says, Chazal, the rabbis of the Talmud, the Midrash, and so forth, then borrowed the term to refer to repentance for one's sin. He says they took a word that in the Bible actually means to go back to your home, and they turned it into a word for repentance. And once the term was given this meaning, it was applied extensively, and all the Musar teachers used it, such that out of habit it became natural. As well, the word Tshuvah never had any other meaning And its original meaning, he says, was forgotten. Not so sure that's true, but okay. But general Tshuvah, he says, according to the meaning of the word, means that we return to the land that we left, for it is our eternal home. Now, I want to just say something here for a minute about what that might do for us. I'm not suggesting that we put aside whatever misgivings we have about all sorts of issues that are happening in Israel. I'm not suggesting we put aside our deeply honed moral convictions about Israel's conflict, about Israel's conduct of a whole array of issues. All I want to suggest is that what Rabbi Alkalai might do for us is to remind us that whatever we think of what's unfolding in Zion, Zion is still home. And what would happen to us? How would we think differently if when we saw references to Zion, we somehow also saw a sense of a hinting that we need to rethink what home is? Now, look at the Machzor. We'll see a couple of different examples of looking at the Machzor now on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This part we all know. It's right at the beginning of the Amida. And so place honor, Lord, upon your people, praise on those who fear you, and hope into those who seek you, gladness to your land and joy to your city. In other words, we don't have to, there's something about Zion that is supposed to evoke not discomfort, but a sense of home. That's what I take from Rabbi Alkalai. I don't think it's necessarily correct that the original meaning of Tshuvah had been forgotten. But I think he does make an important point when he says that perhaps what we all need to learn to do is to think of Zion as home, no matter what other things in addition we also think. Or this is also in the Amida for Rosh Hashanah. V'timloch atahu Hashem Elokeinu mehera al kol ma'asecha, v'har Tzion mishkan kvodecha, u'Yerushalayim ir mikdashcha. And you, Lord, will rule over those who have made. Don't forget, Rosh Hashanah in general is about God's kingship, right? The dwelling of your glory, and in Jerusalem, your holy city. When we want to talk about a world perfected, those are the images that we use of God returning to Mount Zion, of God's glory dwelling in Jerusalem. Again, not to suggest that our misgivings or our machlokot ought to be put aside, but simply to suggest that maybe we could recapture this sense of home. And we'll get to this, God willing, in just a few days in the afternoon of Yom Kippur, right before the last paragraph, before the Avodah service. I'll go to the end. Ata takum terachem Tzion, ki et lechenena kiva moed. You, God, I'll read just the very end, shall rise up and have compassion for Zion, because it is right to be gracious, for the time has come. What if we weren't only speaking to God? What if we were talking to ourselves? What if we were saying to ourselves that now, in addition to everything else that we're thinking about these days, it's time for us to have compassion for Zion? Now is the time to be gracious. The time has really come. So with apologies to Nike, why did I put this slide on? Because here's what I think the mistake that we make is about, and here I'll just stop sharing the screen for a moment. We have to stay right here the whole time. Here's what I want to suggest we think about when we think about Israel. I mean, if you do a Rorschach test, and there's probably quite a number of professional psychologists, psychiatrists, and all sorts of people on this call, knowing the population that you represent. So this is a very layman's attitude to it, but when I say Rorschach test, I mean it in the most banal form possible. This is not from a DSM-5 or anything of that sort. But when you do a Rorschach test with people and you ask them, okay, I want to say a word, you say what comes to mind. I'm going to say Israel. The vast majority of people, may not be you, because Or Zarua, as you probably know, is not exactly a cross-section of American Judaism, right? But if I were to say Israel, most people will say Palestine, conflict, something having to do with that. And if you think about it, the vast majority of conversations that people have when they have about Israel are in some way, shape, manner, or form about the conflict. We can talk about Obama was good for Israel, Obama wasn't good for Israel. Trump is good for Israel, Trump wasn't good for Israel. The Iranian nuclear deal is a good thing or a bad thing. Annexation would have been a good thing or a bad thing. UAE is a good thing or a bad thing. Abbas is a decent leader, not a decent leader. You go on and on and on. You know, Hezbollah can do this, Gaza can do that, Egypt, whatever. But all of those conversations are really, at the end of the day, about the conflict. They say nothing about the substance of what Israel really is. And I'll give you an analogy here, which is going to sound very extreme, but I don't mean, I think it's actually fair. Imagine, put your minds 10 years ago, thinking about America. I know that right now we're all in distress, and quite rightly so. So it's hard to, whatever. But 10 years ago, America wasn't perfect, but we didn't have this kind of agmat nefesh. We weren't brokenhearted and our souls all afire about it. Just imagine 10 years ago, a normal American year. And somebody came to you from some country, God only knows where in the world, and says, I don't know anything about America. I've heard that it's an amazing republic, but I just don't know anything about it. Could you tell me what's so incredible about it? And you said, sure, I'm happy to tell you about America. Well, there was a war of independence in 1776. And then there was a war in 1812. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of them, don't worry. There was a civil war between 1861 and 1865. There was a First World War, then there was a Second World War, then there was a Korean War, there was a Vietnam War, there was an Afghanistan War, there's an Iraq War that I left out before that. You see, America really, truly is an amazing republic. Now, the person would quite rightly look at you and say, I don't know what you're talking about. You didn't tell me anything about the substance of America. You didn't tell me about the dreams at the heart of America. You told me about a list of wars. And now we all know that that's an absurd introduction to what America is. Absurd. But that's exactly what we do when it comes to Israel. Right? People say, name important dates in Israeli history. We all do the same thing. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 2000, 2014, and then ... because God forbid. That's just how we think. If somebody asked you to name the 10 most important moments in Israel's history, I guarantee you that 6 of them that people come up with would have to do with the conflict. Now, it's understandable because Israel's not exactly lived, between the United States and Canada, to put it very mildly. Israel hasn't had that bracha, that privilege, that zchut. But nonetheless, I think you can see from my crazy American analogy that the conversation we have about Israel isn't as different from that ludicrous American analogy as we might like to think that it should be. Now I'm going to go back and share the screen for a sec, and I'm going to try to do it the way Rabbi Bolton wants me to do it. Is it right or is it wrong? Hopefully it's right. Okay.
Great.
In many events, it's okay?
Great.
All right. Okay. Now, why do I have her floating through the air? By the way, I blacked out. I took out the words Nike just because it seemed appropriate, but I will acknowledge for the sake of intellectual property, whatever, that this is a Nike ad. Why do things that history could only dream of? So I saw before that Ellen Ozeri, who is a dear, treasured friend, is on the call today, which makes me very happy. And she will be the first to attest that I have stolen these 2 photographs from her husband's website. I at least had the goodwill, the good whatever sense not to cut out the part where it says copyright Zion Ozeri, and to acknowledge that for the purpose of this, I just went to his website and copied them. Zion is an incredibly, incredibly gifted photographer. Really, I think just a genius of a photographer, and I don't use that word lightly. And among his hundreds of photographs that I love, these are 2 that especially speak to me. The one on the left we actually have in our living room, but the one on the right we don't own, but still I think is an incredible photograph. And why do I put these 2 photographs here? Because the first and most important thing that Israel has done has nothing to do with wars. The first and most important thing that Israel has done is that it has reimagined what it means to be a Jew. It has literally reimagined the Jew. When we say to a New Yorker, somebody says to you, what does a Jew look like? Or close your eyes and conjure up a Jew. You kind of have an image of somebody that looks not that different from us. But in Israel, that becomes much more complicated. These boys are probably in their 20s or 30s now because it's an old picture of Zion's. But I just love that picture because those are 2 Jewish kids. They're holding a Hebrew book. And that's a reality that Israel made possible. And what you see with the man on the right, and what makes this picture so extraordinary, it's a group of Russian Olim who've just landed. They come off the El Al plane, they're landing at the tarmac in Tel Aviv, and he's wearing all of his old medals from the USSR, which are going to mean exactly nothing in Israel. Nothing. And he is going to find that out very, very quickly. In other words, part of making the new Jew is tragically, sometimes painfully, the breaking of the old one. And he's looking off at whatever he's looking at with this kind of sense of a little bit of bewilderment, maybe a little bit of fear. But when the Bialik that we think about, talked about what happened in Kishinev, or talked about what was happening in Eastern Europe in general, what all the early Zionists wanted was a new Jew. And it's important for us to recognize that Israel has created a new Jew in spades. I mean, we don't even think in Israel anymore about this victim issue. I think America has done a pretty good job of that as well. But because we've really created a new Jew. Now, the downside of the power that it takes to be as safe or secure as we are, of course, the downside of that we all know. But that security and safety seems so obvious to us that we sometimes, I think, forget what a miracle it is. It's less than 100 years since we couldn't do very much to save the world's largest and most important Jewish community. This is a wedding that I was actually at a few weeks ago, probably 3-4 weeks ago. It was in Haifa, in the backyard of somebody on Mount Carmel. So you can see it's a very small wedding. I think the laws then were only 50 people. The rule was also 50 people socially distanced. So here's your introduction to what social distancing means in Israel. There is 1 or 2 people that are wearing masks. But in any event, here's why I asked the mother of the bride just yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, when I was making the last tweaks to this presentation. Well, I asked her for a picture of her daughter's wedding. Now, we're very fortunate. It was one of those cases where we knew both kids. She is the daughter of very treasured friends of ours, and he's actually a graduate of Shalem College, where I teach. And I want to just tell you something that he said to her under the chuppah, right after this actual shot was taken. They're both really Zionist kids, but in a very nuanced, thoughtful, deeply analytic kind of a way, nothing bumper stickery about either of them. And he said to her, his grandparents had come from Europe. Her parents came from America. They're both born in Israel. His grandparents were Olim. And he said to her, he said, I want you to think about this, talking to his bride under the chuppah. He said, from the time that our ancestors were forced to leave this land, think about how many weddings had to happen for us to have the zchut of coming back here as a people. I had never in my life had that thought before. I had never thought of every Israeli wedding as the culmination of a string of generation upon generation upon generation of weddings. This is also a new Jew. This is a community of people. You'll see people in the crowd. Some are wearing kippot, some are not wearing kippot. Some of the women are wearing traditional dresses, and some of the women are wearing very anything but traditional dresses. It was a very kind of halachically innovative chuppah, which I always find fascinating and wonderful to see. But for these 2 kids who are so deeply committed to Israel to talk about their own wedding as the culmination of thousands of years of Jews continuing to get married and have families and raise children and have them grow up and get married and have families and raise children, that's also part of the miracle. You can look at a shot like this, which of course the entire evening was of course conducted in Hebrew, and everybody there assumes that, well, obviously it's in Hebrew. What other language would it possibly be in? But 150 years ago, nobody spoke Hebrew really. And now nobody thinks that Hebrew is a miracle. Nobody thinks that the new Jew is a miracle. Nobody thinks that the recreated Hebrew was a miracle. Nobody thinks that it's a miracle that shtisel and fauda and all these other Israeli creations that are originally in Hebrew are the rage of the international economy of ideas and entertainment. We just take all that for granted, but that's not where the Jews were not all that long ago. And I love this picture just because of its intimacy and its naturalness, and because we happen to have been at the wedding, and because of what he said to her about that chain of Jewish weddings, which to me spoke beautifully. Now, here, of course, is also a picture, obviously, that everybody has seen. This is Sadat being greeted by Begin on the tarmac in November 1977, on that Motzei Shabbat, on that Saturday night when Sadat first came to Israel. Now, here I actually just want to tell you the story of that day. Personally for me, I keep my eye very much on the clock so we end in time. But it was a Shabbat. Sadat said he wanted to come on a Saturday, and Begin said, well, you can come on a Saturday, but you can't come on Shabbat. But you can come at 8 o'clock at night. It was November, Shabbat's over pretty early. Come at 8 o'clock at night, we can all get ready after Shabbat, and we'll greet you. Now, that was, of course, 1 o'clock in the afternoon in New York, where I was at Columbia as a freshman that year. And I wanted to see it. But this is back in the days when our dorms didn't have televisions, and certainly nobody had televisions in their room. And so there's no place on campus where I could go see it. And so I decided to go to my grandparents. My grandfather, Robert Gordis, who was a well-known conservative rabbi, lived on 66th and West End. So it was a 60-something block walk, not a bad thing. And I would go to his house where he was going to be watching it on TV and whatever. So I did. I went down the 3 miles, climbed up the 24 floors, and sat next to him. And we're watching this very, for those of you who remember that day, you probably remember it like it was yesterday. It was just an unbelievable thing. And we're watching it. My grandmother on the left, my grandfather in the middle, and me on the right. I'll never forget this. And we're watching, and Sadat comes down the stairs. He's greeted by Begin, he's greeted by Golda, he's greeted by lots of other people. And then the band plays the Egyptian national anthem. And then the band plays Hatikva. And as the band is playing Hatikva, I hear something, I just don't know what I'm hearing. There's this sound. It's not coming from the television, but I don't know what it is. And I'm confused, and I look around, and all of a sudden, I remember my grandfather was wearing a blue shirt, very much like this shirt that I'm wearing, a little darker. He was wearing a blue button-down shirt. And his shirt in the middle was soaked with tears. He was crying. It was the first time in my life I ever heard my grandfather cry. And he was born in 1908. So he was, 68, 69 when this took place. He'd been a rabbi on Long Island during the entirety of the Shoah. If you grew up when he grew up, the idea that an Egyptian president would stand at attention in Tel Aviv for Hatikva was just unthinkable. Now we look at that picture of Begin and Sadat and we go, oh yeah, 1970 something. But it's not, oh yeah, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. And my grandfather's tears were what taught me that it was a miracle. In the same way that not knowing who this guy was from the Minyan, so that I could meet him without the mediation of knowing what his job is, so I could meet the humanity in him, I can never look at that picture of Begin and Sadat or any of those pictures when he arrives without thinking of my grandfather. And since I wrote a biography of Begin a number of years ago and spent many, many, many hours watching videos and looking at photographs and reading diaries and so on and so forth, I spent a lot of time looking at those photographs. And each and every single time, without exaggeration, I thought of my grandfather. And I think that it's important for us to remember that some of these things really are truly miracles, and we ought not take them for granted. And the same thing, by the way, is true of this. Now, we can be as cynical as we want about all of these various people. I mean, I don't really know very much about the two guys on the bookends, but the two guys in the middle, I know a fair amount about. And we all have a set of things that we think about them. But one of the tragedies of the fact that this happened in the middle of the pandemic and the American electoral season and all the stuff that's going on in our shared worlds is that we also didn't take in what this photograph means. This is the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It really doesn't make any difference anymore what Syria does or doesn't do. It really doesn't make any difference anymore what Beirut and Lebanon do or don't do. We desperately need to solve the Palestinian problem, which is a Palestinian conflict, not the Arab conflict. I'm separating them. We need to solve the Palestinian problem, most importantly for us, for a whole array of reasons that we won't go into now. But let's just acknowledge the miraculousness of this. But no matter what you think of the two men in the middle, and we all have a lot of thoughts, no matter what you think, this is an unbelievable thing that just a couple of years ago, a couple of months ago, would have been unthinkable. So I just want us to remember some of the things that have happened that we need to take not for granted. The recreation of the Jew, the reimagination of what it might mean to be a Jew in the 20th and 21st century, and to leave behind the European model, the American model, the Soviet model, and to come here and to recreate ourselves. And all of us who made Aliyah see it when we look at our kids and hear our kids talking. Two of my kids married, thoroughbred Israelis, just kids whose parents were born here, whose grandparents were born here, etc. I see when they talk to their spouses that I'm going to forever be what my Savta was for me, the immigrant, the person who kind of gets the jokes but kind of doesn't get the jokes. But we've created a whole new way of thinking and reading and talking and speaking and laughing here. We've created a whole new way of being Jewish. This wasn't a halachic wedding, but it also wasn't a non-halachic wedding. It was an Israeli wedding, and was at a different time we can talk about what that means. This is miraculous, and this is miraculous too. And all of that is part of what Israel has wrought. That has nothing to do with talking about wars or conflicts or everything. It talks about what's happened inside Israel and Israel's facing out towards the future. I'll end with these two quotes from the Talmud. We come by this, you and I, we come by this tradition of dissing each other very honestly, because these two next quotes are taken from almost exactly the same page of Talmud. One is Tshuvah 110b, one is Tshuvah 111a, so they're the opposite sides of the same piece of paper. And we won't spend any time on the Hebrew now just because of the time. In relation to the basic point raised by the Mishnah concerning living in Eretz Yisrael, Chazal taught, Tanu Rabbanan, a person should always reside in Eretz Yisrael. There's Bialik for you, there's Ben Gurion for you, there's a lot of people for you. Even in a city that is mostly populated by Gentiles, in other words, better to live in Eretz Yisrael, even if you're living in a city mostly populated by Gentiles. We still have a few of those here, but they're talking about a very different reality back then. And he should not reside outside of Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that's mostly populated by Jews. The reason is that anyone who resides in Eretz Yisrael is considered as one who has a God, and anyone who resides outside of Eretz Yisrael is considered as one who does not have a God. As it is stated, right, to give you the land of God, of Canaan, to be your God. So here's a very explicit statement in the Talmud. You better not live outside of the state of Israel, because if you do, you don't have a God. Turn the page. The Gemara relates Rabbi Zera was avoiding being seen by his teacher Rabbi Yehuda, as Rabbi Zera sought to ascend to Eretz Yisrael, and his teacher disapproved. And Rabbi Yehuda said, anyone who ascends from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael transgresses a positive mitzvah, as it is stated. They shall be taken to Babylonia, and there shall remain until the day that I recall them, etc., etc. Rabbi Yehuda felt that the exile was a decree by God, and therefore Zionism was a violation of God's decree. He said basically what the Haredim said in Europe before the Shoah, and what the Haredim used to say in Israel, but have stopped saying it so much in the last couple of decades, that basically Zionism is illegitimate because fundamentally it's a violation of God's plan for history. But on the opposite sides of the same piece of paper in the Talmud, that's right behind Rabbi Bolton, as I saw his office a little while ago, literally on the opposite sides of the same piece of paper, one says if you don't live in Eretz Yisrael, you don't have a God, and the other says if you do decide to live in Eretz Yisrael, you actually are violating God's plan for history. We come to this division, this sense of acerbic looking at each other very, very honestly. It's a tradition that's thousands of years old, going back to the Gemara. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kusk, who lived, well, you can see 1787 to 1859, said in one of his most famous aphorisms, En shalem melev shavur. Nothing is more whole than a broken heart. And I would like to simply suggest by way of conclusion that perhaps the brokenheartedness that we feel, we are all walking around these days with a lev shavur. We are walking around with a broken heart. The broken heart can also create space for things to get in, right? I mean, that was what Leonard Cohen said, right? It's the cracks that let the light in. The broken heart may make a space for us. Maybe if we're Americans, and I'm here including myself, absolutely, who are deeply worried and beyond heartbroken as to what's happening to our republic, maybe we can be reminded now that societies have intractable social problems that are not easily resolved. And therefore, to hold up a sign about Israel that says, end this or stop that or do this or do that, it's a little bit too simplistic. It would be like Israelis walking around holding up signs that say, end American racism. Yeah, we all want to do that. How? How are we going to get there? How are we going to heal the brokenness that is America? Americans, tragically, have no idea. They have ideas, but no big idea. Israelis also have problems that we want to solve. We just don't quite know how. And perhaps with the recognition of the limitations and the faults and the brokenness of the society in which we live, we can look at societies across the ocean which we don't live in, but are still meant to be home, as Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai said, as the Machzor says, and so on and so forth, with a little bit more understanding, a little bit more humility, a little bit more a sense of our own inadequacy, and remind ourselves that just as we don't quite know how to fix everything that's wrong with our home, but would like others to understand its greatness, other people across the ocean don't know quite how to fix their home, but want nothing more from other Jews to understand its greatness and to understand the extraordinary things that it's accomplished for the Jewish people. So perhaps as we get to Yom Kippur and we work our way through the Machzor and we come to the Avodah service, which of course is based in Jerusalem, and we come to the martyrology, which of course takes place in Eretz Yisrael, and we come to all of those references in the Machzor that point to Zion and Jerusalem and so on and so forth, to see it not only as a place of old, not only as a place in modern world of which I am deeply critical or whatever, but as my home, my spiritual home. And that part of my tshuvah has to be to learn to love once again, to heal that brokenness, perhaps because I feel the brokenness in my real home, in my physical home, in my daily home. And if the brokenness in my daily home reminds me how hard it is to repair a society, maybe it can allow me to feel a greater degree of home about that other place across the ocean. And if we can do that, then I think we'll have done what Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai said, to understand that deeply embedded in Teshuvah is a sense of a recognition of this place where I happen to be sitting as our collective home, a collective home that we hope and pray will see still brighter days, as will the place that you call home, and that we'll be able to gather in 1 year or 5 year or 10 years and look back at this period of brokenness as a terrible time, but a time that we got through, a time that we got through individually and as a Jewish people and as humanity altogether, a time that perhaps with this Seret Yemei Teshuvah ushers in what we hope and pray can be a period of healing. So I wish everyone a Gemar Chatima Tova, a year of healing and hope and repair. And thank you once again for the really very, very great honor to share some thoughts with you on Seret Yemei Teshuvah.
Absolutely beautiful words, inspiring words, as always, as we knew they would be. Challenging words as well, and invitations. L'zaman hazeh, we at the end of the Shechianu, and we reclaimed the words of the Shechianu this year, despite feeling that brokenness, Danny. L'zaman hazeh is a hazmanah to this, our world, our lives, our generation. And it's my privilege to react a little bit and to ask you this question. And while I'm reacting and asking Dr. Gordis the first question, you can use the chat function to write in your questions, and I will be moderating the chat and presenting questions to Dr. Gordis. But here's my reaction. And we, in our book club, read this wonderful new book, that the latest We Stand Divided. By the way, you should know that all of our youth, through a grant here, that we have a tzedakah fund that provides books for our youth to build a library like PJ Library did for the little ones. We built it up for our teens and our college students. And so Israel,
very nice, thank you.
Israel, a History was in that list. And I think at one point saw the glue that binds us, or felt like the glue that binds us was the dream of Zion. And post that reality and things getting real, early Zionism, early political Zionism, people actually making the move, they were starting to conceive of building a home. And you're asking today, potentially, that light coming in, or I'll reference what I like to think about as the kintsugi or the kintsukoro, the pottery that's broken and remade with gold in the cracks that the Japanese artists do so beautifully. That gold, right? Jerusalem of gold. Jerusalem was a destination at some point. You're asking for people to connect with that. One of the slichot today is all about Jerusalem.
All right.
You're asking for people to feel that home could be the gold, could be the light. You're asking that people do hakarat hanes, and that historia, atzma, and the inspiration of people who actually did the work, like in the temple. People did this work to build the Jerusalem, to build the Israel we have today, and people are expressing it. But I think you're well aware, and I want to get your, again, invitation here to the folks who are a little bit more where any tribalism still exists, or even individually, because a lot of egoism has spilled into American Judaism, right? And we're dealing with a very individualistic society. Their Judaism is very individualistic. It's about my spiritual journey. It's about me, the promise of the Yerushalayim Shel Lamala. It's about the spiritual Jerusalem. It's about the Aliyah. And we even use that sometimes. Anywhere can be, wherever I'm going, I can make Aliyah. You can bring Rabbi Nachman from Bratslav. And that could be metaphorically that in today's major chord American Judaism, the idea of the promised land is the promised land of your soul, a la Shlomo Karlebach.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the invitation in terms of expanding that on those? Do those three really meet the spiritual American Jew who's looking to tune in? And how do we respond to this notion of Israel, the promised land of our hearts, versus the actuality that, Israel exists today?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a huge question. We could have a very long conversation about it. I think, look, first part of what you pointed to, quite rightly, is the non-tribalism of contemporary American Judaism, the highly individualistic nature of American Judaism. And that I think is very problematic. I mean, there's plenty of things that are wrong with Israeli Judaism. I mean, plenty of things that are wrong with Israeli Judaism, but the lack of tribalism is not one of them, and the hyper-individualism is not one of them. In other words, we have other problems, which we could talk about at great length. But I think that, look, I think American Jews, and some of this is in the book and some of it's not, but, and I'm grateful to you for giving the book that exposure. But look, American Jews have, certainly a younger generation of American Jews, have really deeply imbibed this notion of the problematics of tribalism, and so on and so forth, and the paramount nature of the individual. Now, there's a great irony in what's happening in America today, of course, right? Because what you have in America today with the resurgence of identity politics is that groups have once again become supreme. But the great irony is that the vast majority of American Jewish kids on college campuses in America feel much more comfortable and compelled, both comfortable and compelled, to stick up for Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ, and a whole array of other perfectly legitimate and critical agenda issues. Don't get me wrong, they're critically important, but would feel very uncomfortable sticking up for an issue of Israel or even Judaism, because we see ourselves as part of the privilege. We see ourselves, as that's a word that I think gets misused a lot these days, but nonetheless, we think, the question, are Jews white? That whole question everybody likes to talk about. And I think that's one of the sad things about American Jewish life today. And I think unless one is willing to embrace the notion that Judaism is a people, then you can't fall in love with this place, because this place is too much of an anomaly. It's too much of an aberration. Religions don't have countries. They just don't. Like, what's the Methodist country? What's the country for the Methodists? What's the country for the Presbyterians? What's the country for the Baha'i, for whoever? I mean, there's lots of countries that have lots of those kinds of people living in them, but a country for there really aren't those kinds of things. Peoples have countries, religions don't have countries. So the more that I am either a Jew by religion, which is a Pew standard, or a Jew by none of those things, which is also a Pew standard, then Israel's always going to be in a novel. It's not, what do I need a country for? What do I need a country for? And I think part of what we have to do to fall back in love with this home is to fall back in love with the people that was born in this home. Now, the people wasn't actually born in this home. We all know that, right? But when Ben-Gurion wrote in the Declaration of Independence, Be'eretz Yisrael kama Am Yehudi, in the land of Israel, the Jewish people was born, it was A, not entirely true, but B, very important to say. Because what he was saying was that peoplehood and landedness are inextricably linked for us. But America has been corrosive of a sense of Jewish peoplehood, right? Because what Blaustein and many others wanted to say was, I can't be part of the American people and part of the Jewish people, right? Woodrow Wilson, as we saw in the book, used to go around saying to newly naturalized American citizens, you can't be a hyphenated American. You can't be an Austrian American or a German American or a Spanish American or a Polish American. And then comes the Balfour Declaration 1 year later, and Zionists say to American Jews, okay, we got a green light, help us build it. And American Jews are in a deeply problematic place, because I might want to be a Jew by religion. Think Will Herberg, right? Protestant Catholic Jew, right? We're part of that cluster, but not part of the nationalist clusters. And I therefore think, it's much more to say, but I think that if you love your people, if you love the Jewish people, and I think that that's a goal that people like you and me have as part of our mission. I remember once interviewing a prospective rabbinical student who became a rabbi, and a very well-known rabbi, but I learned something from him at his interview, which happened many times. But somebody said, what's the job of a rabbi? Which is a good question to ask. Wasn't my question. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, the job of the rabbi is to help Jews fall back in love with their people. That's a pretty profound take for a guy that hadn't spent one day in rabbinical school. And I think that it's really, really true. And I think it's what we're trying to do. And part of what I think, why does birthright work, right? Why can you take 40 something crazed college students, put them on a bus for 10 sleepless days and nights, shuttle them around, and then send them home and think you've changed their lives? And you actually have changed most of their lives, because they actually encounter peoplehood. They just see Black Jews and white Jews and immigrant Jews and native Jews and rich Jews and poor Jews and intellectual Jews and worker Jews. And they see history from thousands of years ago and history from 50 years ago and what happened yesterday. And so that's peoplehood. That's not just history, because it's also the language. I think one needs to love that. And I think there's ways that we should just, I'll just, sort of as a aside and then stop, and then we can open it up or whatever. I'll just give you two other examples from Netflix. I mean this really very seriously. I don't mean this to be cute at all, right? And the fact that Shtisel and Fauda are both wildly popular shows abroad is, I think, a fascinating kind of a thing. But you should ask yourself, actually, why are they wildly popular in Israel, right? I mean, who made it a very watched show, Shtisel? The Haredim didn't, right? They didn't watch it. I mean, they may have watched it on their smartphones a little bit surreptitiously, but they're not the ones that gave it the rankings. So Chiloni, secular Israelis, are watching a show, a loving show about Haredim, the same time that they're outside protesting that the Haredim are getting in the way of our passing the lockdown that we need to pass. Today they're not in the way, but in general they are. And so why would you possibly want to watch a show that's so loving? Because you have a sense, I don't want to be like them, but I live in Ramat Aviv Gimel, and I work in Tel Aviv, and I take the elevator down from one steel and glass tower, and I get in my Audi, and I drive to Ramat Aviv Gimel, and I get in another steel and glass tower and take the elevator up to my apartment. I have everything a person could possibly want, and I feel empty. And how come they don't have anything that I have? And not only on television, I see them on the street. Why do they look happy? I don't want 12 children. But they have 12 children, and they're happy. And part of the reason, by the way, that they were so badly exposed to COVID in this country is there's 6 kids in a room. How are you going to isolate in your apartment when you're 6 kids in a bedroom? You can't do that. But people here understand that there's what to learn from them. Mm-hmm. Right? Shtisel is about a profound, it's peoplehood. We share the streets with them in a way that Haredim and non-Haredim don't share the streets of New York City. Right. They're both in New York City, but you don't share the streets with them. Yeah, I share the streets with them.
Someone from New York the other day, who's not a Jew of New York and in New York, said, you don't understand even what it means to be in New York with the kind of crowds of Jews that you have and the kinds of gatherings that you make. Hopefully, I hope this is going to be a softball question, and we're not looking for too many compliments about our unique community. Greatest hits albums, you mentioned Leonard Cohen. Artists like to put together the greatest hits albums. What are the greatest hits of American Judaism, though? A lot of times people will say, oh, Danny Gordis is down on everything because they're as polarizing as everybody else when it comes to looking at a person. So you made us open our eyes, and I know that you really value so much that's going on in America, and you just mentioned Francine's book. And so, right. We can mention that at Or Zarua. What are the greatest hits going on over here that could be good not only for the Jews in America, but good for Jews in Israel?
1,000%. Look, let's do it very quickly. First of all, Israeli feminism is a product of American Jewish feminism. We would not have the thousands of women that we have in Israel studying Talmud if we did not have American Jewish feminism come first. It came first. It was a derivative of American feminism, which was a derivative of the Second World War. But feminism in Israel is a gift of American Judaism. Liturgical creativity, the shul that I normally go to on Friday nights here when things are normal, which they haven't been in a very long time, is called Tzion. I guess it's appropriate for today's conversation. The rabbi is Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum, a conservative rabbi some of you may well know. And her shul is very Israeli, but it would not be the shul that it is had she not been apprenticed, so to speak, to Gordon Tucker for so many years and then spent time in Canada as well. In other words, she is who she is, and the shul is what the shul is because of an American sense of what a congregation is, because of an American sense of cultural and liturgical creativity, and so on and so forth. Look in South Jerusalem, all the institutions here that so enrich Israel, but within a kilometer radius of where I am sitting, which is actually the amount of distance that I'm allowed to go out of my radius now, according to the new guidelines. But what's here, right? Pardes is here. Shalem College is here. The Hartman Institute is here. The Israel Democracy Institute is here. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Those are all American creations. Those are creations of American Jews. The values of American Jews helped create those institutions, and they enrich Israeli Judaism tremendously. So, yeah, it's easy to be critical of all kinds of things that are going on now, as are lots of Americans about lots of things going on. But I think Israelis, and I say this explicitly at the end of the book, Israelis need to be deeply aware of how indebted they are to the cultural and the liturgical richness of America and how it's influenced Israel. And Americans need to be deeply aware of how Israel, as a model of peoplehood and a whole array of other things, is actually a hugely important injection of new life into America. We need each other desperately, which is why I was urging that perhaps we use this brokenheartedness, which we're both feeling. This is a terribly sad day in Israel. And when you open up the news and you see the first refrigerated truck is getting delivered to Haifa, when we had it down to almost zero, it's entirely our fault. Entirely our fault. And 10% of the people in Israel who died in August died of COVID. I mean, that's outrageous. So it's a very sad time in both of our communities. And I think we have lots to worry about repairing each of our communities. But I was hoping tonight to suggest, or today for you, to suggest that we can use some of this brokenness to see through and to be more accepting of the weaknesses and the challenges that the other faces, because we face our own challenges too. We desperately need each other. We need to embrace. And that's what I'm hoping Tshuvah bring us back, the Rabbi Alkali notion, that what repentance has to be in part is returning that love that I feel for that homeland.
Beautiful. I mean, you got us to the end of the book. For anybody who didn't finish it, you just heard it. And there is...
We should buy it anyway.
Yeah. And there's a true sense of Tshuvah here, that you've invited a different kind of Tshuvah, and almost like a beacon home, a lighthouse standing, the Jerusalem of gold, as I'm conceiving of it. I do have a few comments that said that folks in the 60s felt that kind of passion, the tears of joy that you described in your family, that someone would want to get off the plane and kiss the ground and make a Shehecheyanu and really be a part of that drama. Today, you showed the Russian immigrants. Nefesh B'Nefesh, I think, is the first private organization that is managing Aliyah from North America, vis-a-vis a partnership with the Israeli government. And it's, if you will, becoming somewhat corporatized. Do you think the future of Israel lies in more Aliyah, or do you think the future of Israel lies in, learning something from Haredi families with 12 children?
Or neither.
Or neither.
Or neither. I mean, the future of Israel might lie just in perfectly normal families having whatever number of children. By the way, I mean, secular Israeli women in Tel Aviv have a much higher birth rate than any women group anywhere in the Western world, right? It's important to remember that Tel Aviv women who are totally secular have more children per woman than American Jews, than Americans in general, than people in Europe, to say nothing of Japan, which is a negative population growth, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not worried about the demography. The only reason we have to be worried about demography is not to do something stupid on the West Bank that would change the balance of the scales. But that's a whole other conversation, which we're not going to get into tonight.
My question. There have been times that, political Zionism was one of those times. Bolshevism was around, provinces got together, anti-Semitism spiked, Jews were on the move. The war happened from 3 million to 300,000, you used the example. We needed a place for European Jews to flee. They weren't all getting into America, part of our dark chapter of history. The ever wandering Jewish people is an image. And the idea that there should be shifts in Jewish population on the globe is not just one in our generation. It's not just a 19th, 20th century idea. There have been hundreds of years, and then Jews move. The notion of an active a promise that we wouldn't seek too much Aliyah from New York is part of the great history that you've explained as well in the past. If people don't know about it, there were some discussions about whether or not we would encourage Aliyah to Israel per se.
Right.
Does does part of the tshuva, even though we have this homecoming sensibility that you're encouraging, does it mean getting more serious as a liberal Jewish community about supporting Aliyah to Israel?
So I'm going to put the question differently. And I mean this to be, if it's going to sound, I don't know, brooding than it's meant to be. Let's remember that no great Jewish diaspora simply faded away. Not a single one of them. Not one. In other words, every single great Jewish diaspora has ended in catastrophe. The little diasporas have faded away, right? Rhodes, etc. But great diasporas did not fade away. The Babylonian diaspora ended because of the rise of Islam, and it was not pretty at the end. Polish Jewry ended, we know exactly how. North African Jewry ended, we know exactly how in the 40s and 50s. The Spanish golden age of Spain ended, we know exactly how. We have always had a sense, and I lived my first 40 years of my life in America. We've always had a sense that somehow we're not part of that pattern. Why? Why? I mean, the people in Spain in 1485 didn't think they were part of that pattern either. And Polish Jews in 1925 didn't think they were part of that pattern either. And Jews in Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria and Egypt in 1940 didn't think they were part of that pattern either. In other words, all it takes is for the sands to start to shift. And for me, one of the questions that's always been bewildering is, how did the Jews not get out of Germany in time? And can't you read the tea leaves? But when do you read the tea leaves? I mean, there are things that are happening in America now that are highly worrisome from the left and the right. And I think that American Jews want more or less to either not talk about it or to reassure themselves that it's an aberration of this particular political period. But what if the world that I grew up in, America in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when it was pretty darn good, what if that was the aberration? What if what we're seeing in America now fundamentally is a battle between, is America about white Christian people or lots of other people, and the Republic is going to tear itself to shreds over that issue? And for the white Christian people, we're not white Christian enough. And for the other people, we're too white and too privileged and too well off. And we could find ourselves in the middle of this thing. I'm not talking about train tracks and all that kind of, but we could find ourselves in a very uncomfortable place. I don't think we ought to talk about Ali. I think we ought to ask ourselves just a kind of a principled historical question. At what point why do Jews always wait before it's too late? And there's one last anecdote. I was in Boston for 7 months last year because our daughter had her second daughter and was going back to graduate school. So I said to her, "How are you going to do that?" And she said, "Oh, that'll be fine, Abba." Now, if she'd never had a kid before, I would have thought, okay, she doesn't know because she's never had a kid before. But she'd had a kid before. And so I thought, okay, she's actually just lost her mind. So I said to my wife, yeah, it's going to be fine if we go rent an apartment down the street from them and rent a car and take care of those kids, because otherwise it's going to be, and that's what we did. We went for 7 months. And I spent a lot of time in Boston meeting lots of interesting people. I remember one night I was meeting with a group of very, very powerful women executives, like CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that sort of thing. About 7 or 8, maybe 12-ish women, unbelievably talented people. I mean, gifted, successful beyond anyone's wildest imagination. I think 3 of them were Jews, 4 of them were African Americans, and the rest were whatever they were. And we were talking a little bit about this whole exact issue. And I said what I just said to you, Rabbi Bolton. I said, well, but obviously there's not going to be a time when there's going to be train tracks and Jews in cars. And one of the African American women interrupted me with a tone of hostility. And she said, "Why are you so certain about that?" And I didn't know what to say. And I was silent. And then she said, "I think you radically overestimate America's goodness." That line will stick with me for a very long time. And I would just simply, maybe this is a way to begin to close. I don't think the question is whether to talk about Aliyah. I think the thing that we should understand, though, is that the people that came here and built this place felt that the Jews needed a place where their welfare would never be dependent on the whim of anyone else. And regardless of which way America ends up going, there's enough going on in America for us to now be reminded that this idea of Jews being at the receiving end of history is not a thing of the past. One doesn't have to want to come here. One doesn't have to want to make a life here. One doesn't have to encourage other people to come. But I think one should at least internalize enough of what America has offered us in the last 2 or 3 years to say, well, there is something to that Zionist vision. It may not be for me, but it's darn good for my people that it's there. And if I only get there, I think there's an element of Tshuvah in that as well. If I only get to a place of saying it's not for me, but the brokenness of my world now has led me to understand that project also much better than I did, I think that's a different kind of Tshuvah also. I'm much less worried about policy than I am about open-heartedness. I don't really think it matters that much. I mean this really very seriously. How many American Jews come to Israel? Israel's going to rise or fall on the basis of what the people who live here do, how we live, how we educate our children, etc., etc. There'll be more aliyah, there'll be less aliyah, whatever. I think the responsibility that American Jews ought to take on themselves at this moment is simply to open hearts, to understand the extraordinary nature of what's been accomplished, to understand the deep insight of Zionism, that history always repeats itself, regardless of how things unfold in America in the next 10, 15 years, and to at least look with greater sympathy, understanding, and even gratitude for the heroism and the bravery of those people that came in the 1880s and the 1890s and 1900, who built for us what we all take for granted. Nothing in life could be taken for granted. That's what Netana Tokef is about.
Amen.
Right? Who by fire, who by water, who by plague, which we never used to pay attention to, and we all saw those words this year, right? I mean, and the Tana Tokef reminds us nothing can be taken for granted and nothing should be taken for granted. And we understand in a way that we didn't 12 months ago how unbelievably precious human life is. We all understand that better than we did, no matter what we say. And none of us are unthinking or uncaring people, but we get it more, how fragile is human life. We've been opened up to that. Now let's try to do the same thing about this little place that I call home, but that we all in some way, I think, ought to think of home. I don't have to agree with it, don't want to have to live in it, but should I think embrace it without resorting to policy about this conflict or that issue, embrace the miraculousness of it and say, and it's got its problems. In the same way that I look from here and say, America is still a miraculous creation with tremendous, tremendous problems. But America's not about the problems. And when somebody asks me why are you still proud to be an American? Why do you still have an American passport? Why all those kinds of things? It's got nothing to do with the specific policy. It's a dream. I talk about Jefferson and Hamilton and so on and so forth. And we should talk about Bialik and Herzl and Ahad Ha'am and Jabotinsky and so on and so forth. Let's open ourselves up to the grandeur of each other's dreams. I think that's Tshuvah too. And I think if we can make that our goal for the next few days in Yom Kippur, we will end this period bigger and more open than we might have entered it, which would of course be a great gift for each of us individually and for the Jewish people as a whole.
Amen. Amen. Really inspired by your words, your emet, you're bringing truth to the discussion in a way that's so refreshing. Your depth of soul and depth of spirit and invitation for us to make really more expansive Tshuvah this year. Really so important. Gemar Chatimat
Tova to all of you as well. A year of good health and of healing for all.
Thank
Take
you
care.
so much again. Everyone, thanks for being here, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.